Hi, how are you? I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about this term Xennial, which is a term I heard a couple of years ago and have kind of let slide in the background. I thought it was kind of neat, but I just kind of let it slide in the background. I was like, whatever. And then, for whatever reason, I've been thinking about it more lately. Xennial is considered to be a micro generation of people born from 1977 to 1983. Now, put that in the context of the larger, more traditional style of measuring generations, in which case, for instance, a Generation X person is somebody born roughly from 1965 to 1980, 81. And a millennial is somebody born roughly from 1981, 82 to about 1997. And then anyone after them would be Generation Z, and then anyone before Generation X would be boomers or silent generation, greatest generation, etc., etc. So, Xennial is kind of an interesting thing because this popped up a couple of years ago. But before that, in 2011, there was an article written in Slate. And the article was about a woman who was talking about how, as a late Gen Xer, she feels a little disenfranchised by Gen X. She's not really Gen X, she's not really millennial, she sort of feels torn in between. And at the time she said, well, this seems to apply to people born during the Carter presidency. So she calls us Carter babies or whatever. And then, I guess, she had gotten the article out there or whatever, and somebody said, oh yeah, I call it, Generation Catalano, from the character Jordan Catalano from My So-Called Life, which aired during 94, 95. When I would have been in high school, when she would have been in high school, when other people born during the Carter presidency would have been in high school. So, and I think that concept, that idea of this sort of micro-generation or this cohort that existed based on these similar experiences of things that they had in the early 90s and in their childhood, sort of evolved into this Xennial thing. And when it came into being called Xennial, they added a few years on to the tail end of it, 81, 82, 83. And it started being more about, being more defined. Like, these kids were analog childhood, digital, adulthood. And personally, I'm on board with that because for doing video type stuff, I learned everything analog video and film cameras. And then by the time I was an adult, just basically right after I became an adult, digital video cameras started coming out where you could link them directly to your computer and edit the video directly on your computer, and there was no fussing with two VCRs and an edit deck and stuff like that. So I had learned all this stuff about analog video only to then be thrown into the digital video world and had to learn all of that on a screen. But I was still young enough that I was easily adaptable to that. And I had been using computers for a couple of years then. So, that was great to me. So I understand that concept perfectly. And that's kind of how Xennial has kind of gotten defined, is this, analog childhood, digital adulthood. Sort of the last generation, the cusp generation that combines the two together. A very small micro generation, very small number of years where this sort of made the transition. And I, generally I'm fine with that. But it seems like it's two different things. Despite the fact that it kind of, one might have come from another, or they kind of got put together or whatever, it does seem like it's actually two different things in some sense or another. Because there's a lot of millennials, especially older millennials, born in the early 80s and even mid 80s, who are like, I don't feel like a millennial. And they seem to want to really jump on board. Well, at least some of them seem to really want to jump on board the Xennial thing because they hate getting labeled a millennial because of the bad rap that millennials have gotten in the media. At the same time, there's some Gen Xers who feel the same way, and I think the whole Generation Catalano / Carter babies thing was really geared more toward Gen Xers. And I think it was really geared more toward Gen Xers who felt like they had grown up in the shadow of actual Gen Xers. People who were born in the capital years of Generation X, which seems to be late 60s, early 70s. At least in terms of pop culture. When pop culture talks about Gen X, they're always talking about, the movie Reality Bites or Singles or Nirvana or whatever, which all come from actors and musicians and stuff born in the late 60s and early 70s. And so anybody born 77, 78, 79, 80, like, yeah, like they might technically be called Gen X, but they don't really, like, they've just sort of been globbed onto the back of what was actually the spotlight era of Gen X, which was in, people who were born in the late 60s, early 70s, and who had been adults by the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. Whereas, like myself, I was born in 97. I was entering high school in 1993. So I was, I wouldn't become an adult until the late 90s, 97. So it's kind of interesting because I do feel that way myself. Like, and me specifically because I have 3 older siblings who were all born in the mid to late 60s. So I understand what Gen X is from that era. And I also understand how I felt growing up, being at the very least 10 and a half years younger, and at the most 15 years younger than my oldest sibling. So for me, like, they were like older aunts and an older uncle growing up, and less like siblings. We didn't have the same experiences growing up. They were a big influence on me, obviously, and technically we had the same exact parents, so we are biologically the same generation, but in terms of actual lived experience, things felt different. So, and I get that even more than a lot of my friends who were born the same year as me, who are like, they'll easily just be like, yeah, we're Gen X, like, because they don't understand that difference between Gen Xers in the 60s and Gen Xers in the late 70s. Like, they don't have that frame of reference necessarily, whereas I do. But, so for me, I do feel more torn between the whole millennial Gen X thing. And I think the whole concept of like the Xennial or pre-Xennial name, where it was, Carter babies or whatever, like, I think the concept of that was, like I said, people who were Gen Xers who felt a little like they were left out of the spotlight of Gen X because, the spotlight had sort of passed them over and then went straight to this brand new shiny thing called millennial, which they were too old to be a part of. Millennials, older millennials, on the other hand, a lot of them, they also feel passed up. Because when the term millennial got coined in the year 2000, they weren't talking about people born in the early 80s and mid 80s. They were talking about people born in 1990, 1989, 1993. Like, they were talking about younger millennials. So there's this whole media blackout period that exists from the mid 70s to the mid to late 80s, where, like, we're all just kind of hanging in the balance here, and we're like, what? Like, hello? So I get it. I completely get it. And I completely understand why there would be millennials who want to jump on the Xennial thing, because it's like, oh, that's a tag that can describe people who feel left out in between Gen X and millennial during this media blackout period where, this 10, 12-year period, we're not getting talked about. So I get it. But I also think it's two different things. Again, one is very specifically the experiences of people born during, say, the Carter years, who are saying, coming out saying, well, I was in high school during peak grunge and, when the show My So-Called Life was on the air and I had very specific experiences. And so did these other people. And then there's the wider, broader Nintendo generation, maybe you can call it, people born from the mid 70s to the late 80s or whatever, who are like, we got forgotten about, man. Like, we're all part of this forgotten about, like, even more so than Gen X, because at least when they, every once in a while the media mentions Gen X, but we don't even have a name. And so I think a lot of people then are trying to jump on the term Xennial for that reason. So yeah, other than that, yeah, I that's pretty much my take on it for now, and I'll link that article, that Slate article below, and you tell me what you think about this whole situation, and whether you agree with me or not, or what your take on it is specifically. Thanks.